Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Improving's Virtual Lunch and Learn. Before we start, I want to inform you about a feature in the presentation that will make this session more interactive. Please make note of the question mark icon in the upper right of the presentation screen. Clicking that icon will open the Q&A feature that will allow you to send our moderator questions to be delivered to our presenter at the appropriate time. And we're excited today to present Devlin Lyles, President of Improving Houston, and Dave Reines, Vice President of Technology at Improving Minnesota, who will be discussing the business case for domain-driven design. And so with that, Devlin, the floor is yours.
Well, welcome everybody. We're continuing a set of conversations, and to put that in a little bit of context, one of the things we found is that improvers love talking deep through the technical problems, how it'll impact our clients and the business, but oftentimes these conversations happen behind closed doors. And we wanted to open up those doors in kind of the safest way we could to deconstruct some of those so that it maybe helps you have a difficult conversation or the appropriate conversation as you're struggling with some of these same decisions. And we've looked at the business case for CQRS, the business case for testing. And today, luckily, I'm going to be having a great conversation with Dave talking about the business case for domain-driven design, kind of what it is and how it impacts. Now, Dave and I have talked ahead of this, and it's not going to be a traditional conversation. We've both agreed that we're going to keep each other in check. If I use acronyms or jargon, he's going to call me out on it. And if he uses acronyms or terms I've never heard of, I'm going to call him out on it as well. And we're going to be digging into the business and technology reasons for some of these decisions. So with that, Dave, thanks for this. I'm really excited about kind of digging into this. I want to start off with, what is DDD and why should I care?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And DDD is really just about coming up with a shared understanding of your business problem that you're working on. What are you actually trying to solve? And coming up with a ubiquitous language. A ubiquitous language is a big part of domain-driven design. And that language facilitates further conversation between the business, engineers, product owners, the entire team to kind of create that more precise language for people to have those discussions. It also handles things like defining what pieces, what is your core domain. In domain-driven design, your core domain is going to help you focus on things that are important to your business, what's vital to your business. And that can help with things such as, where do I want to focus my investment? Is it a buy versus build decision? Which way do I want to go? And the other thing it does is, a lot of legacy systems that we're dealing with have a lot of legacy terminology. A lot of times when we go in with clients, we'll have them just talking about some legacy term or acronym that no one really knows what it is. Oftentimes, you'll ask them, what does that mean? What does that stand for? I don't know. But it has meaning and people are saying it all the time. Well, let's shift away from that to actual business terms and how we can help drive business value for the organization.
It's probably the best description I've heard of DDD, but you included something I'd never considered. You said that DDD could help with a buy versus build.
Yeah.
Because I've always heard it in the build side of things.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think, when you look at the domains that you define within domain-driven design, you tend to focus and categorize those domains into core domains, which are the domains that are differentiators for your company. And then you also have supporting domains that are a little bit custom, but they're not really driving the differentiation for your company. And lastly are just general domains, just general things that you can buy the off-the-shelf piece for. That those core domains is where you're going to want to have significant investment because they're differentiating your company from others. So it's where you want to put your high-performing teams potentially, or continue to make sure you have good product focus on that domain or subdomain within the application. So it really can help you make that and drive that decision. And can actually help you lower some costs too for some of the custom development, because you can say, hey, here's a subdomain that makes sense for us to focus on, to build for ourselves and to own long term. And it's going to be a little bit more complex, but we're going to want to focus our efforts on that. Whereas the commoditized pieces, we can break them off, we can create some nice boundaries between them and understand the interfaces and how they talk between each other. So it really does help facilitate some of that as well.
It's interesting. I always kind of thought about it as an all or nothing in the build space, but what you're saying is I can actually just break it off, and like if learning management is important to me, but there's 100 options off the shelf, not core to my business, I can go grab one of those and integrate,
Right.
and only spend on the integration.
Yeah, for sure. And then in those terms, it's important to understand the types of integration and those relationships between the different, in domain engineering design, they use the terms bounded context. So between those bounded contexts, what are your relationships? Who owns the relationships on those contracts is important to think about too, because that'll help you understand how you need to even staff your teams, how you need to be ready for change, and some of those types of things coming down the road as well. So
you introduced a new term there. You said bounded context. Can you give me kind of the brief, like, what is that?
Yeah. So when we start breaking down our domains, we have the domains and subdomains. A lot of times those subdomains have bounded context, and it's just an exercise of breaking up that domain from a solution standpoint. We want to make sure, and a lot of the problems that happen with legacy systems, that these got into these big, huge monoliths that turned into the big ball of mud. And what ends up happening in those types of situations is there's just everything is intertwined. The relationships between things are so intertwined, and there's no meaning to what's there, and it becomes really difficult to change the system. So to help with that, we start to break those apart into different subdomains and draw bounded contexts through context mapping exercises and understand the relationships between them. So it's just really a set of services that are separate from each other, and that have contracts between them in order to understand the relationships between them. And often different teams are assigned around bounded context as well, so that you can develop in parallel some of the functionality.
Okay, so it really is the business domain. So when you say domain, you're not talking improving.com, you're talking about like our accounting group or our delivery set for agile coaching or development.
Right. Yep. That's
awesome.
Right.
So you touched on something. You mentioned like legacy systems and breaking those down. You also mentioned earlier moving away from legacy terminology. Like, what value does that bring to the business?
Yeah. No, and I think it's important to look at that. I think the value is in the language that you have between development teams, or between the engineering team and the business, so that you can more effectively and more precisely build the functionality. So from an implementation standpoint, oftentimes when you have that language, you create those models in that language and glossaries and different models for people to look at, to understand and communicate. Now, when those requirements are later on being communicated in that language, everybody's on a common ground about what that means. So we can even bring that into the implementation and the code, which then means that the engineering teams, as they're into code, as they're into different problems they're trying to solve, they can bring that back up to the business, and the same terminology can be used. So it's hugely effective in creating that common understanding of what needs to be accomplished.
I love that. And something that seems to play into that is, like, if I'm rewriting an old system, there's probably some things I don't want it to do the same way, because we've either learned or grown, or inefficiencies kind of baked into that legacy terminology. So moving away from it kind of opens us up to reconsider that versus just make it do what the old one did. Right.
Absolutely. Like I said earlier, I mean, going back to just the old terminology, you really didn't understand it, didn't really talk about what it did, but we want to focus on driving business value, right? So in order to do so, come away from what the system does, how the system's built, break it up into those domains, and then start focusing on that value. The other value that it brings too is it allows you to deal with experimentation in a certain way. So now you can start to, as you break up those domains, now the value that you bring is you can start to experiment within those domains, and because you've got those well-defined contracts, you can make changes without worrying about breaking other pieces of the system. So that is hugely important too. Being able to create parallel paths for both teams to world build, test, deploy, and then also that experimentation capability helps speed up innovation as well. So I think that that's an important thing to consider with domain-driven design as well.
I love the idea of experimentation, but in our case, like we're rewriting a bunch of our legacy stuff, considering a unified platform. Experimentation inside that rewrite, that can be pretty scary. Like I've seen projects go over and scope creep because we were trying to get to feature parity, but also add a bunch of experiments and new things. Mm-hmm. How do we deal with that kind of dynamic tension?
Right. No, that's a good question. And, this is where those contracts and that understanding of the relationships between the different bounded contexts or the different domains is really important. When you think about it, if you have a well-defined contract, you can experiment within that domain and nobody is impacted. But if you need to make a change, that contract is versioned. And with domain-driven design, you also know the relationship between the different bounded contexts. So there's different relationships. They use the concept of upstream and downstream contracts. So an upstream contract, everything flows to the downstream contract. So think about the different relationships that might be there. You might have a conformist relationship where whoever's downstream just has to deal with whatever's coming to them, right? So if you have that type of relationship with another context, whether it's within your company or with an external third party, it's an important flag to realize, because you know that you're either going to have to deal with that or you're going to have to go back and potentially raise it to the business and say, hey, this relationship with this other group, whether internal or external, is not well fit for what we're trying to do. So let's try to negotiate a different relationship between groups. So that's something to consider as well. But back to your question, the experimentation then can be taken care of because we have well-defined contracts, versioning, and now we can experiment in smaller chunks. If you think about the old big ball of mud, the monolithic systems, we can't do those types of experimentations because there's too much risk to impacting other groups because that clean separation isn't there. And people are, quite frankly, afraid to change those systems because they're brittle. The people that have been there forever are afraid to change them, or the people that built it are gone, right? So they don't understand fully what it might mean to change and experiment. But as we break these things up, we have those well-defined boundaries, well-defined contracts, and we can feel more comfortable in some of that experimentation.
I like it. And we talk about like the small frequent pieces driving just continuous evolution of the business, but having protection from big breaking changes kind of making their way down. It helps me understand that. The thing that popped into mind is we've got a client right now dealing with, they've got shipping wired through all of their stuff and they want to try out different shipping providers, and they can't do that right now because it's wired together. Right. That would be an experiment that would be pretty easy if shipping was its own thing. Mm-hmm. And they can moderate shipping cost, which today is huge.
Right, absolutely. And one of the interesting things is when you talk about some of the language that we talk about, different things like a product or an item within shipping has different meaning in different bounded contexts. So going back to the definition of bounded context, that helps you define it. It's really each bounded context has its own set of meaning. So an item in the shipping context might be different than an item in the invoicing context. And that's important to realize that it does have different meaning. When you have those monolithic systems, everything's just all bundled together and there's one item and it's got all the shipping and all the invoicing and everything that it needs to know about in that one spot. But as we separate those, we have different terms, we have more well-defined models, more precise models that are separate in each of those contexts. So it really helps bring a more elegant solution that we can then change more easily. So
I've heard DDD talked about as like more elegant solution, almost as a panacea, like a solution for the modern development struggle. It's going to build better software faster, cheaper. Is it really that, or is it just a different way of approaching it to manage complexity?
Yeah, and I think it's a little of both, right? Like you can potentially get some more parallel development built when you use DDD, you break it up into the domains, you come with that more product-oriented mindset, and now you can run different paths and feature paths in parallel when you have really large teams, right? Rather than having everybody working on one code base and having all the different intermingled pieces. So it can help make things better and faster. But it's not going to solve everything for you. It's not going to, but it does become a framework for you to talk through, right? And it just makes it really helps drive that conversation. And I think it increases quality by doing so, right? Because I think the engineering teams have a better understanding of what's actually happening as you create that ubiquitous language. So I think it's important that quality is a big focus of it. I also think that for onboarding new team members, as you go from client to client, for the most part, the patterns on the technical implementations are pretty similar across clients. I mean, you do find some different domains or different implementations that are different, but what really changes is the domain and the business problem you're trying to solve. So if you have that well-defined language, it's easier to bring people on too. So that could help a little bit with, I need to increase velocity of the team. I need to spike up this team and run with more people for a while. Well, if there's a good, strong understanding of terminology and language within the team, it makes it easier to bring those people on.
Okay. And so you mentioned learning the ubiquitous language. Does that mean I'm going to need to understand code and technical language, or are we going to have to teach the developers the business language and finance? Like, how do we get to that standard language?
Yeah, it's really the business language that you're focusing on. And there's some different techniques to get there. One technique that we've used in the past is event storming is a technique to get there. And it's just kind of a really collaborative type meeting where everybody gets together and just starts by just putting the different business events that happen within the business. What are the things that are important that happen within this business? You might mention shipping, so like a shipment would be an example of a domain event that would occur. And you just put all the domain events up on the wall, and then you put them in order by time. And then people just kind of collaborate and come up with this language as they're talking about these business events. And then you can talk about, well, what are these things that trigger these business events, the commands that trigger the events, as they're called, and who's triggering them? Is it an external system? Is it an acting person? Is it some time that's lapsed or a certain time period? These are all things that you can do within this event storming to then come up with an aggregate. An aggregate is an entity within the domain that you track. I don't want to get too mixed up into the terminology, but you track an ID or an identity within the system. So I think that going back to what we were talking about here, so the event storming is a way to come up with that business language. It's a really collaborative way. It's a great way to get people to working together to provide some of that camaraderie between business and engineering teams, and just really come together and define that language. And your language will evolve too, right? You'll come up with new terms as you continue to move through the project, and just make sure that you continue to evolve that language as that happens as well. So,
gentlemen, we have a couple of questions from the audience that I think would be good to interject here, if I may. The first is, would you say that domain-driven design is better at managing expectations than alternative approaches?
Yeah, in terms of managing expectations, so I think it can give you like a common terminology around that, but I think we don't want to say that domain-driven design is a solution for managing requirements or requirements gathering. All of that still happens, but what it does is it gives you that language to communicate the requirements in, right? So I guess it can help with some of that communication as you're communicating back to the business, but I don't think it's not your project methodology to say, hey, here's what we're going to have done by when.
Okay, and the other one is that oftentimes when you're on a project, technical terms influence the business language, sometimes in unnatural ways. Can DDD help clean that up, or do you just roll with those changes as they occur? How does it help with that situation?
Yeah, I think it helps by having the discussion on it, right? And just not acting by habit. Sometimes we get habitual in how we talk, especially when we've been with a company for a really long time. And it's really, really hard to get rid of some of that old legacy terminology that really doesn't mean anything. But sometimes it actually has meaning. So maybe it's actually important to bring into your language. But if that's the case, let's have that discussion. And if it helps everybody come to a shared understanding of what has to be done, then make it a part of your model, make it a part of that of that ubiquitous language. But do it very intentionally. Don't do it out of habit.
All right, that's all the questions. I'll leave it back to you.
To add on to that, while it doesn't remove the BA and the requirements gathering pieces of it, like Dave mentioned, it does sound like it elevates technical expertise and subject matter expertise as a part of that conversation of, let me walk through the business domain rather than that technical nomenclature of how the previous system implemented it, which I think answers that second one very well of like, we can at least talk about it. My favorite version of this is at Improving, we are addicted. And I do mean addicted to 3-letter acronyms that end with P. EIP and IBP and EDP and ELP and SLP. And I wish I was joking. And if you're new, you're like, oh, they're all like growth programs, except they're not. And so I think having that intentional conversation Dave mentioned is like, no, let's actually break these down, stop attacking each other with a wild pack of jargon, might be a good thing.
Yeah, there's no doubt. And I like what you said about the domain experts and making them a big part of the team. I don't think I've put enough emphasis on that, but it's very important in domain-driven design that you have that domain expertise in the room, and not just try to bring someone in that's playing that role, right? You really need to have that person that understands that domain, and the intricacies of the business, right? And during those discussions, and I know that can be difficult. So they don't always have to be a full-time member of the team, but if you're starting with that event storming type event to start driving out that language, really try to make sure or try to commit to having that person involved, and then create that relationship with the business analyst or product owner so that they can get to that person directly if needed, or the engineers too, right? It's great if you can have the domain expert on the team, full time, but oftentimes that's not the case. But try to involve them as much as possible.
Okay, one more question here, Dave. You've mentioned event storming a couple of times. Can you describe that activity? Because I don't think you've actually described what event storming is and how it gets played out.
Yep, I think I talked about it a little bit, but essentially you get into a room with the domain experts and the rest of the team, and then you just start with what are the domain events that happen within the system. Like a shipping event we talked about earlier is in the domain event. So what's everything that happens in the life cycle of an order for that shipping event? Order placed and invoiced, all those different things, right? And you put those events up on the wall, like with a sticky note. Potentially have different colors for these events, domain events. And then the next thing that you usually talk about, and one thing that's important too, it has to be very conversational. Just let people go up. Everybody should feel very comfortable going up, sticking their own sticky on the wall, and then making sure you have a conversation on each of those events with the rest of the team and talking it through and trying to then order those events in sequence. And it just really comes up is a great way to start the discussion. And then after you have those domain events, you can take the commands. What are the commands or things that are triggered to create those events in the system? And those commands can come from users of the system, external systems, or sometimes even time lapse, right? So if something a certain amount of time has lapsed, or a certain date, whatever it might be, might trigger a command that raises that event. And then we can get into the aggregates and what are the aggregates or entities that are involved with these events. And then from there, you kind of have a model and a language that you can talk through and just take that off the wall and start trying to say, hey, how does this map out to the solution space that we're trying to build? And the other thing that you can do within there too, is talk through the bounded context. What are the contexts that start to emerge around the different aggregates and domain events? And then what are the contracts that through the context mapping exercise to say, okay, what are the relationships between these aggregates? Who owns the relationship? Is it a customer-supplier relationship? Is it a conformist relationship? Just to try to understand those relationships between the entities and ultimately potentially the teams that are built from the project.
So if I were to boil that down to like a specific business flow, right? Because we've used this in the past with value stream mapping, and then we go into kind of event storms inside that value stream. It's like, okay, here's how we make money. And we say it's getting a training class. Well, we get a request for a training class. And there's some details around that class, and then it goes to scheduling, and then we assign an instructor, and then it happens, and then we invoice for it, and then we have to follow up on the invoice to get paid. It's like, all right, that's the flow. Those are the events. Those are the business things that happen. Notice I haven't talked about any systems yet, right? And we go, okay, where do the requests for classes come in from? Well, they come in from our website or current clients for a private class or just a single student for a public one. And you start talking about all that nuance and go, okay, so there's students, there's clients, there's all this kind of, you start seeing these objects come to life in that space. And then you have an instructor and you have a schedule, and all of those terms I use to describe the workflows suddenly start popping up as entities or objects throughout these domains. And then there's some of them that are core to the idea, right? Like class. It's like, oh, okay, that's my aggregate. Did I understand it roughly right, Dave?
Yeah, no, I think you're right on track, and ultimately, sometimes I think people are trying to do this too perfect, right? Like just get together, have the conversations, try things out. If it works well, it works well, and iterate on it, so I think it's important to just kind of give this stuff a try. And does what work for your team. And remember, the ultimate goal is to get to that shared understanding as a group so that you can build the right quality software. So, yeah.
Now, I would be falling down if I didn't ask my two favorite questions in this. And we were joking about this before we got started today that I was definitely going to ask. How does it impact the budget?
Yeah. I really don't think it impacts the budget much at all. I mean, you might even say it positively impacts the budget because you're building better quality software, but you're just bringing the team together, and it's just a model for you to do that, right? It's a way for you to do that really drives the discussion and just becomes very intentional about things. You could just go, the other option is just start coding right away and get everything done, but then you'll eventually get back to, well, what does this mean? What does this mean? And then, it just slows things down at that point. So, I don't think that it's going to add additional cost or price to the budget. The other thing is, I think, there can be a little bit of danger of overuse of domain-driven design within the decisions. Like you need to really do what's right for your team. And, a lot of times, like I mentioned, the event storming model that you come up with, you could start writing code and maybe never maintain that again. There's nothing that says that you have to continue to maintain that model. Sometimes the model just becomes the code, right? And that's okay, as long as you can continue to have those discussions. But it really depends on the teams. Sometimes it makes sense to continue to maintain those models because there's just more conversations that need to be played out, and there's, for whatever reason, long-term maintenance, you want to have some level of these models to be able to describe things. So I think you just really need to do what's right for your team. And I don't think it's going to impact budget in a negative fashion.
Okay. And so if it doesn't impact budget, it doesn't make it more expensive for us to go through and do this. Lower some of our costs over time. Like, is it a cost savings thing in the long run to have the bounded context and stuff kind of implemented well?
Yeah, I mean, once you do get to that solid implementation of your different contexts and the contracts between them, I think it does lower that cost of change over time, because you understand those boundaries, you understand the relationships between them. And now based on that type of relationship, where it's a customer supplier or whether it's conformist, you're going to have your team ready to deal with whatever type of change might happen within that interface or relationship. So you can better manage and fund your teams more appropriately for that. And those, because you have well-defined contracts, you can version those contracts and make change without having to worry about breaking systems. When you change a contract, it does obviously require some coordination between teams, but it's well defined. You know what that coordination has to be, and it allows you to change over time. I think change is something that's inevitable. We all know that change is inevitable, and we need to build our systems. Whether we have change from business drivers coming in, or we have change from security pieces that are coming up, or compliance that we need to deal with, or whatever it is, people and change, especially lately in this environment, is critical to be able to change your systems, and being able to do that quickly can even lower cost potentially, but also increase innovation and just kind of help your business move as the broader environment changes in the business you're working within.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, when I'm getting any benefit, in this case, lower cost to change, faster speed to market, greater innovation rate, I'm typically paying something. Am I going to pay for that on onboarding and specialized skills? So I have to hire more expensive people. Like, what's the cost of doing this over the long term?
Yeah, so I don't think you're going to have to, I don't think it's going to increase your cost. It's more just coming up with a framework for people to talk, right? And to people to come up with the right approaches to things. There'll be a little bit of cost to getting your domain experts involved, right? Like that's going to take some time and some focus for those domain experts. There's going to be a little bit of cost just upfront, just for the team to kind of get familiar, but it's very minimal. Like I said, I don't think that anything's going to be required from a long-term standpoint, and it actually might help lower the cost. I think I mentioned this earlier about onboarding people, right? When you onboard a new person to that team, they're going to be able to understand that domain better. Like we talked about earlier, the technical implementations are pretty similar. The various contracts that you go to, or various organizations that you work with, it's really that business domain that changes. And if you can help people get up to speed more quickly, and they can very fluently talk with the business, then that's really going to help them be more productive sooner. So it could potentially lower those onboarding costs that occur.
Okay, and so let's say we've got a rewrite on the horizon. We're not doing it right now. We've got that big ball of mud monolith you talked about. How do I go about experimenting and trying out DDD and my big ball of mud monolith when I'm not doing a rewrite, like when I'm just trying to make tomorrow better? Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's various techniques for starting to break off pieces of the monolith, right? So domain-driven design is a good way to talk about your monolith and what it is, and then start to break it up in, like we talked about, into those boundaries. And then once you have those subdomains all defined, you can talk about, hey, what would be a potentially, you want to start with a core domain and just break off a piece of some of the core domain because it's going to add the most value. Or you might say, hey, you know what, this more general domain is something that we really don't want to maintain long term anymore, right? We're maintaining the cost of this, so let's break this thing off and just come in with an off-the-shelf implementation. It provides at least the framework to go into that monolith, break it apart, talk about the different subdomains of the monolith, and then come up with a long-term product roadmap and strategy to say, hey, what can we start to break up, and how can we move forward?
So once we identify, like, hey, I want to carve off this part, we don't want to maintain it, how would you go about extracting that from the big ball of mud? Do you have to like cover it with tests like Claudio talked about a month ago? Like, what's a safe way to do that? Because you mentioned like experimenting without fear once we have this, but I'm a little fearful before we have it.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, there's some patterns that you can use. So one of them is a strangler pattern to kind of break that off from the existing application. So if you can imagine requests coming into an application, just starting to have like putting some type of routing piece in place that says, okay, I'm not going to route this request to this monolith. I'm going to start to route it out to another domain that I'm building with microservices or in the cloud or whatever, however I'm building that, and starting to routing those requests over. Nice thing you can do is you can start to do that incrementally. You can build some smarts into that routing, like, hey, let's do it by customer, or let's do it by percentage of requests, whatever makes the most sense for your business that minimizes that risk. And then the other thing that we've done in the past too is for some of those legacy calls, we've actually captured those calls in real time with some streaming technologies such as event streaming with Kafka to push those requests and the response that came back into some type of event streaming technology that then we can consume, call the new service, and then compare the result to the result that came from the existing system and say, hey, are these the same? Doing it field by field, and then understanding, what percent are these the same or different? So now I've got automated real production data, data that I'm working with, real-time dashboards, because I'm using a streaming technology to be able to say what percent of the fields coming back from the new system are exactly or the same as the old system. The other thing that's nice with this that we've seen with this in the past is it also gives you the ability to say, yeah, a lot of times in these older systems, you don't understand what the logic should be. So it became a way to kind of reverse engineer, or at least to trigger us to say, hey, this is different. Let's try to reverse engineer what this actual field should be in this case. And then you can get to, like a 99.9% match. Oftentimes you might even find bugs in the monolith that you can fix. And then you can go to the business and say, hey, we're really close and ready to start diverting traffic over. We've got this 99.9% match. We know that the 0.1% is some bug that happens in the legacy system, and it brings that comfort to them because it's real to the business, especially when it's one of your core domains. I mean, to say that we're just gonna, okay, let's try it, right? Like that doesn't fly. It's very strategic to the business. You have to have that assurance when you roll out that not only is it going to work, that it's going to scale as well. So this is a nice method for scalability and measuring latencies and things like that as well.
So you mentioned one of my favorite topics right now, which is scaling. I mean, Google Cloud, AWS, Microsoft, they're all reporting record level profits, and they're driving tons and tons of consumption of their cloud resources. And so being on the business side of that, that means if I get it wrong, then running it in the cloud is actually expensive. Maybe not as expensive as owning my own servers, but sometimes even more. Does the boundaries and the context change the way I engage in like cloud cost management and DevOps? Because it sounds like I could break it out differently, and you mentioned it helps with scale.
Yeah, I mean, if that's another piece that I've worked with in the past, very similar to this, is breaking off from the monolith just for scalability, right? So we have a part in the monolithic system that keeps, potentially crashing the system, or we know that we're going to have a huge, this part of our business is growing so much that we need to be able to scale it. It's dealing with some old legacy database that it's too expensive to try to scale. It doesn't scale horizontally. So let's try to push some of that out to the cloud. And you do have to worry about latencies a little bit there, because as you scale, you're out in the cloud, you have the data center, and you generally have to work with some of that either reference data or other related data in those other contexts back on-prem. There are some strategies that we've used to get that data out real time to the cloud across those bounded contexts through the domain events, right? So using things like Kafka streaming to in real time as those domain events happen, either through change data capture or whatever might happen in the on-prem system, we can get those out within seconds to the cloud, and then we make sure we have all the reference data and anything else that we might need to satisfy the requirements in the cloud. So yeah, it just becomes a real nice way to, as you see some of those bottlenecks in that legacy system, start to break it off. And the domain-driven design part of it helps you create that proper boundary of what you're breaking off, so that you can reason about that real well. So, yeah.
Awesome. I got one last question for you before we kind of open it up to the floor of folks that we haven't already heard from. So you mentioned Kafka streaming a couple of times. Mm-hmm. It sounds like it supports the DDD space well, but it's a tool I'm not familiar with. Can you give me like the 90-second on it?
Yeah, I was going to try to not talk about technology today as we were trying to get it, but so Kafka is an event streaming technology. It takes an ordered log of events is its real differentiation, and it scales horizontally. So the log of events are all persistent, and it allows consumers to read those events in order. So when you think about domain events and microservices and event-driven architecture, it's really a critical piece of the infrastructure is some type of event streaming persistent technology that allows multiple consumers to consume that data in an ordered fashion, and then persist it to whatever system that it needs to. But the nice thing is it, like I said, it's all persistent. It works across really well. It replicates really well across regions or data centers. So across physical distances, geographical distances, it works really well. And if that consuming system is down, or the cloud is down, or not the cloud is down, so or the path to the cloud is down from on-prem or whatever it might be, it allows those events to continue to stack up, and then the consumers can come online and bring them and deal with them as well. So it's really changed quite a lot of what we do with messaging and microservices, and a great way to get legacy data out of those systems with change data capture as well. So
awesome. So empowering tool, but not required. We could implement DDD a bunch of different ways. This would just help us a little.
Yep, for sure.
Awesome. So Tim, do we have any questions? If not, I've got one last thing, and Dave, I've got one last question for you to wrap us up.
We do not have any more questions at the current time, so Devlin, I'll leave it to you to wrap up.
Fantastic. So the thing that I've taken away from this conversation and talking with Dave and getting ready for this was the focus on the design and the customer-centric, the domain and business-centric piece of it is a DDD's focus, is that get to a ubiquitous language, define the boundaries of your business. Like if this is the stuff the accounting team does and there's a handoff to the operations team, like those are probably separate contexts. And the funny thing is I've got workflow charts for people that I do this with all the time, but I'd never thought about applying that to the design of software. Software was always just one big box for me. And you'd have different arrows inside the box, but it was all in that big thing. So breaking that up from a business perspective, I thought was really cool. But what's the one big thing that you take away, Dave, that, like if everybody leaves here and doesn't take anything but this one thing, what do you think that is?
Yeah, I just say, take the time to be intentional about coming up with that language of what you're trying to solve. Because really you want to get to a shared understanding of what you're trying to build. And, it provides a great framework to do that, but stay focused on what you're trying to solve. Don't be focused on doing DDD perfect, because that takes your attention off of the problem that you're trying to solve, right? But use it as a tool to facilitate those conversations and come up with that language and shared understanding.
Fantastic. Dave, I greatly appreciate you taking some time out of your lunch, and thank you everybody for joining us and having another kind of great conversation around the business case for different technical tools. We're going to be back next month talking about UX and customer-centric design with David Belcher, head of our UX practice out of our Dallas office, and really digging into how that can impact the overall cost and profitability of a project. So thank you all. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.